Okay, this is the second part of our lecture that is introducing the book of Deuteronomy, picking up now with covenantal structures and just beginning to discuss major themes in the book of Deuteronomy. When I say covenantal structures, one of the things that I want to emphasize is that there are multiple covenantal structures in the book of Deuteronomy, and I believe multiple structures really in every book of the Bible. As an analogy, consider, for example, the heavens. The sun and the moon and the stars are not a simple system. In other words, there's no straightforward method of putting it all together. One day is actually not 24 hours. A week, therefore, becomes more than 7 days, since each day is longer than 24 hours. A month is not always 28 days, but even if the month were always exactly 28 days, 12 months would not give us the 365 days that we need for a year, and so forth. God has created the universe in such a way that it is extremely complex. There are multiple systems, multiple structures going on, so to speak, and I think that that is an analogy to the way that he's given us his word. So covenantal structures, for example, in the book of Deuteronomy, thinking of multiple structures, the first and most obvious of the structures in the book of Deuteronomy is that the book of Deuteronomy is the speeches or sermons that Moses gave to the people of Israel on the first day of the 11th month of the 40th year, the year that the Exodus wandering is to end, the year that Moses, in fact, maybe even the very day that Moses has to die, and soon after, the Israelites will finally go to the land of Canaan. Well, the book of Deuteronomy then is given to us as Moses' final sermons to the people of Israel, and actually, it's Moses' teaching to the people of Israel. There is every occurrence of the word teaching in the book of Deuteronomy. It's not always Moses that is the subject of the teaching, but it is usually, and you don't have anything like this in Exodus or Leviticus or Numbers. The book of Deuteronomy is the book where Moses is the teacher who is teaching the people that he loves and actually telling them to teach their children after them. There is, of course, post-Mosaic editorial work. A few people believe that chapter 34, which records the death of Moses, was written by Moses himself. And there may be other editorial work done at much later times, but the basic book is the work of Moses. If we think of the book as speeches of Moses, Jim has analyzed it as 5 sermons with other material. And there you have the outline that Jim has suggested. The importance of viewing the book of Deuteronomy as Moses' speeches or sermons is that it represents Moses' very last words. And Moses is self-consciously imitating Jacob, who brought his 12 sons before him as he lay on his deathbed to give them a word of blessing, to speak his last words to them, to encourage them, to maybe rebuke them sometimes, but to bless them. Well, that's what Moses does in the book of Deuteronomy, as chapter 33 makes explicit, where Moses blesses the 12 tribes of Israel, imitating Jacob. Joshua in chapter 24 imitates both Jacob and Moses and blesses the tribes of Israel before he dies. And then David imitates Jacob and Moses and Joshua and blesses his son Solomon and the people of Israel when he dies. And then finally, Jesus himself is imitating Jacob and Moses and Joshua and David in John chapter 13 to 17, where he brings the 12 men who are the basis for the new Israel. He gives them a word of blessing the day before he has to die on the cross. And over again, he says to them, "My little children." Well, that's the perspective that Jacob has blessing his sons. Moses, looking at the people of Israel, sees them as his beloved children, and so he speaks to them with this heartfelt passion to teach them to love God and to fear God. It is not, in other words, law in the way that we usually think of law. It is instruction. An interesting commentary that gives you various other structures in the book of Deuteronomy is written by a man named Dwayne Christensen. It is a large 2-volume commentary that spends a lot of time talking about structures. And one of the things that you see in his commentary is that there is a great deal of chiasmus in the book of Deuteronomy. His description of this or that chiasmus may not always be persuasive, but many of them are. And he's done some very interesting analytical work. In fact, he thinks that the whole book of Deuteronomy was written as a song, and he divides it up in terms of Israel's liturgical calendar. And a structure like that may also be possible in the background. Jim has written this book, Covenant Sequence in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And this, for me, is the most helpful book in studying the covenantal structure of the book of Deuteronomy. And Jim points out in this book that there are multiple covenantal structures. You could describe the covenant in terms of 3 aspects, thinking perhaps of the Trinity, 4 aspects, thinking of the 4 corners of the world, 5 aspects, which is a very typical covenantal design, 7 aspects from the 7 days of creation. Jim offers a 12-aspect outline in that book. Here is Jim's 7-part structure that he gives in another lecture to the book of Deuteronomy. But I'm going to be looking at the 5-part or 5-aspect structure that Jim gives us. Gary North actually follows Jim's 5-part structure. I've revised the numbers here just slightly. North makes the 5 aspects: transcendence, hierarchy, ethics, oath, and succession. And the acronym that you get from that is Theos, which makes it easy to remember. Jim prefers to describe the 5 aspects of the covenant in a different way in order to emphasize the content in a broader form, and also to escape the possible misunderstanding that what you have is something that is very legal and legalistic. So in the beginning of the covenant, where we have transcendence again, but it emphasizes the fact that God initiates the covenant relationship. The covenant is God moving to his people and drawing his people unto himself. The second part of the covenant, which North called hierarchy, Jim calls historical overview, because he wants to show you that there's always a breakdown and then a renewal of order. And again, then, we're emphasizing the grace of God and the working of God. We're not just talking about a hierarchical establishment, although that does come into that aspect of the covenant usually. The third aspect of the covenant in the book of Deuteronomy is stipulations, and Jim points out that they are given with a view to the coming distribution of the land. When you go into the land that the Lord your God is giving you is an expression that's repeated in various forms throughout the book of Deuteronomy. And that means that the stipulations, the commandments, the ordinances, and the statutes in the book of Deuteronomy are not abstract laws, but it is instruction for how Israel is supposed to live in the land that God is giving them. Again, grace is a central emphasis even in the stipulations portion of the book of Deuteronomy. From Deuteronomy 27 to 30, you have sanctions. Gary North calls this oath. You have witnesses who are covenant witnesses to the covenant, both among the people of Israel, and actually God calls heaven and earth to witness against the people of Israel in chapter 32. That's part of the succession or the rest or the enhancements part of the covenant from chapter 31 to 34, where you prepare for the future. Covenants always concern succession. Covenants are always multi-generational. The central portion of the book of Deuteronomy is the ethics or the stipulation portion, as you saw from Jim's outline. It's chapter 4, verse 44, all the way to chapter 26 and verse 19. Now, the beginning of this section is an introduction, chapter 4, verse 44 to 49, followed by general stipulations, which is the whole of chapter 5. And the whole of chapter 5, as I'm sure you know, is the Ten Commandments. You have a historical introduction in chapter 5, verses 1 to 5. Then you have the 10 words, chapter 5, verse 6 to 21. By the way, they're never called 10 Commandments in the Bible. They're always called 10 words. And then you have a historical conclusion at the end of chapter 25. And that's followed then by specific stipulations from chapter 6, verse 1 to the end of chapter 26. And what's amazing about these stipulations in the book of Deuteronomy is that they follow the 10 commandments in order from the first commandment to the 10th commandment. And you have this information in Jim's book too, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this, but just to show it to you like this. This is not something that is unique to Jim's understanding. In fact, Jim refers to a Jewish scholar, Stephen Kaufman, who wrote an article called The Structure of Deuteronomic Law. And he is followed by Walter Kaiser, who basically agrees with Kaufman's analysis almost everywhere in his book, Toward Old Testament Ethics. Jim disagrees with Kaufman in a number of places, and I think that Jim's analysis is superior. But you can find even Lutheran scholars in the late 19th century who see that the book of Deuteronomy follows the 10 Commandments in order. The 10 words, of course, are unique among the laws of Moses. They're given on Mount Sinai to Moses as the very essence of biblical law. They were originally written on 2 tablets by the finger of God. Of course, that version of the 10 Commandments was lost when Moses came down from the mountain and broke it. He had to go back up and get another set of the 10 Commandments, but that was apparently not written on the tablets by the finger of God. And in the book of Deuteronomy now, we have the 3rd version of the 10 Commandments. And what Jim emphasized in his lecture, and maybe also in the book, I don't remember, was that this 3rd version is the most important. It's the enduring version. It's the version that the people of Israel are supposed to bring with them into the land of Israel. And they're supposed to look back to this version, the final version of the 10 Commandments, as the basis for, or the essence of, all law, all instruction, all wisdom in Israel. It's important to note that the prologue for the 10 Commandments, chapter 5, verse 6, defines a grace relationship. I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Law, so-called, the 10 words, and the rest of biblical law as well, do not begin with commandments and follow with grace afterwards. The law is not, in other words, Lutheran, where the law comes and condemns you and overwhelms you with a sense of sin, like John Bunyan carrying the burden of sin on his back or something. The Bible begins with grace, and God emphasizes the grace that he has given to the people of Israel at the beginning of the 10 words. The first 5 words from Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 7 to 16 continually emphasize grace. Yahweh, your God, is an expression that points to the grace of God in the Exodus. The name Yahweh occurs 10 times in the first 5 words, and the name God occurs 10 times in the first 5 words. And it's important to emphasize that all 10 commandments rest on the first commandment, but they all rest upon the prologue as well, the grace relationship that is established in the Exodus. I'd also like to say that all 10 commandments are interrelated. So, for example, the first 5 and the second 5 can be set up beside each other as parallel. Honoring God and honoring his image is a relatively obvious parallel. Idolatry and adultery are often put together in the Bible. Honoring the name of God and not stealing are not quite as obvious, perhaps, but the parallel is there. Keeping the Sabbath, and the ninth commandment is not just you shall not lie, but the ninth commandment is you shall not swear a false oath against your brother. So both the Sabbath, which is the day for renewing oaths, and the ninth commandment, which is about false oaths, those two commandments are related. Honoring parents and not coveting is more difficult to explain the relationship, but I think that it's there. There is also a clear relationship between the second and the seventh commandment in Hosea, which is the idolatry, adultery that we pointed out, but as well the second and the 10th commandment. Colossians chapter 3, verse 2 says covetousness is idolatry. The third commandment and the ninth commandment are put together in the book of Deuteronomy in an interesting way, because the Hebrew word for do not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, the Hebrew word for vain, in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 11, is used again in the 10th commandment, the ninth commandment, where it talks about swearing vainly. Okay, it's a different word than what is used in the book of Exodus chapter 20 with the ninth commandment. Moses has rewritten the ninth commandment or edited the ninth commandment in such a way that he brings the ninth commandment and the third commandment into relationship. I think that this way of describing the commandments, not only in the book of Deuteronomy, but in various parts of the Bible, actually invites us to compare all of the commandments to one another and consider every possible relationship among the 10 words. Most obviously that to have God as our God means to walk in the way that the 10 commandments instruct us to walk into. For major themes in the book of Deuteronomy, I want to begin by introducing a particular expression, Yahweh Eloheka, Yahweh Eloheinu, the Lord our God. In the Old Testament, it is used 648 times. It's a major expression of God's grace, of course, grounded primarily in the Exodus. But the first time that it appears in the Bible is actually in the book of Genesis, chapter 20, an ironic passage in which Jacob is deceiving his father, Isaac, when Isaac says to him, how did you get the game that I asked for so quickly? Jacob, remember, is pretending to be Esau and giving his father this stew. And Jacob says, the Lord your God helped me, or something like that, right? And that's the very first time this expression occurs in the Bible. But it's often in the book of Exodus. And it's in the book of Exodus at some very crucial and important places. For example, in Exodus chapter 3, when God meets Moses and is telling Moses how Moses can speak to the people of Israel about who Yahweh is and how Yahweh has appeared to him, the expression Yahweh, your God, appears. Chapter 6 is also talking about the name of God and what the name Yahweh actually means. And then, of course, in Exodus chapter 20, verse 2 and 5 and 7 and 10 and 12, it's the 10 commandments. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And passages from chapter 3 all the way to the end of the book of Exodus are all really about the saving grace of God that is displayed so abundantly to Israel. And that expression, Yahweh Eloheinu, and whatever other pronoun is used with the Lord our God, the Lord thy God, the Lord his God, the Lord their God, whatever. Those expressions appear 27 times in the book of Exodus. In the book of Leviticus, it's 26 times, and it's the same kind of emphasis, and again, at very important places. In chapter 11, verse 44, you shall be holy because the Lord your God is holy. The commandment for Israel to be holy is a commandment to imitate God. Chapter 18 and chapter 19 also repeat this expression over and over again, and also in important passages. In the book of Numbers, the Lord our God or similar expressions only occur 6 times, but in important passages as well. Now, in Deuteronomy, this expression occurs 308 times. Okay? It's impossible to emphasize this expression more than the book of Deuteronomy does. Almost half of all of the occurrences of this expression in the entire Old Testament occur in this one book of Deuteronomy, which makes the book of Deuteronomy the book of grace and the book of love, the book of God's gracious redemption of Israel from Egypt, more than any other book. That is a theme so major, I cannot even begin to address it in the time that we have, but you have all the references there and you can look into it on your own at another time. I'll stop this portion of the lecture now and we'll pick up with the next portion.